Hello and welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be showing you the best way to paint an STL file digitally and how to import that file into TaleSpire. We're going to be turning this into this. In this step-by-step guide, I'm going to be painting this STL file from EldritchFoundry.com. Now, there's a few reasons I've chosen Eldritch Foundry. First of all, I actually want to use this mini ultimately in TaleSpire, and I kind of want it to match aesthetically, and seeing as Eldritch Foundry has already made most of the minis in TaleSpire, it kind of seems like a no-brainer. Also, I like the more realistic look to their characters. It's not as cartoony and out of proportion as some other custom mini makers. Also, the STL files are super easy to paint. I mean, as you'll see in this video, once you've actually got the steps down and kind of memorized and a little bit more practiced, you can breeze through painting these things. It's ridiculous how quick they are. And perhaps, most importantly, the STL files are really cheap. I mean, as you can see on the screen, it's $3.99 per STL file, which is a heck of a lot cheaper than some of the other brands out there. Also, if you want to save a little bit more, we actually do have a discount code down in the description, which if you use that on eldritchfoundry.com, you'll get an additional 15% off every order. Now, this character here is Skyden from our web series, The Adventures of Skyden and Wrenick. If you want to check it out on our channel while you're here, be my guest. But we're going to download this file and then get started. Now, to complete this process, you will need 3 pieces of software, all of which I shall leave links in the description. But the first piece of software that we need is Blender. Now, this is a 3D modeling program. It's completely free, and we're going to be using this one to convert our STL file into a different file format. And then later on in the process, we're also going to be using it to resize and scale down our finished mini. The next app is where we're going to be spending most of our time during this process. This is Adobe Substance Painter 3D. Now, this one is available as a 30-day free trial. You do have to pay monthly afterwards, or you can actually buy the app outright over on Steam. I'll leave links to both options down in the description. The third and final app that we're going to be using is Unity 3D, which is a video game making software. Now, this one we're going to be using to actually convert our painted STL file into a video game asset, which we can then take into TaleSpire. Again, available completely free, link down in the description. So, once you've got all of those apps downloaded, installed and ready to go, we can begin. Okay, so once you've downloaded your STL file, you will have a zip folder. And if we open that up, we can see we've actually got 2 different versions in here. Now, this is because Eldritch Foundry gives 2 different versions of the STL file, the unified and the split. We're not interested in that version, we're interested in the unified version, which is the complete model as we saw it on the Eldritch Foundry website. So we're going to take that version, drag it out onto our desktop. We're going to rename it to make it a little bit easier to remember. So in our case, we're going to rename it to Skyden. We're then going to put this in a project folder just so I can keep tabs on things a little bit better. So first thing we need to do is to convert this file in Blender. So we open up Blender and we have the welcome screen, which we can just click off of. And then what we want to do is just delete everything that's in this scene. So we press A to select everything, press the delete key to delete everything. And then if we go to File, Import, STL, and then we go and find where we actually put our STL file. So there's Skyden, leaving all the options as default. Then when she comes in, you've got a nice big close-up of her feet, which if you use the mouse wheel to scroll out, and then if you hold Shift and middle mouse button, you can move the model around to get a better view. Now, she's looking a little bit blocky, a little bit rough, so what we're going to do is we're going to right-click on the model and select Shade Smooth, which makes it all nice and smooth and much better looking. And then, while our mini is still selected with the orange highlight, if it isn't selected, it'll look like this. So you want to make sure you click on the mini to make sure it is actually selected. Then we go to File, Export, and we select the FBX file format. And then we're going to pop this in the same project folder. We're going to rename to Skyden, and then leave all the settings as default, click on Export to FBX, and then we move on to Substance Painter. So now that we're in Substance Painter, we need to tweak the UI to really focus it down on just the core components that we need. So first of all, we can close off the welcome screen, and then we look on the right hand side and we can see a whole bunch of panels. The only ones we need is the layers panel here, so we're going to click and drag that out, and then below it is the properties panel, and same again, click, drag, and that's all we need. We can get rid of these other ones. Next thing we need to do is in the top corner, there's an option to switch the viewport. We need to select adjust the 3D only view. You can press F2 instead, but in case you want to know where it is, that's where the option is. So we click on that, and that gives us just one singular view to work in. Now I like to just move the two floating panels over a little bit and extend them out to make them a little bit easier to see in the next step. So now we're going to do a new project, so you go to File, New. Now what we're going to do, we're going to leave the template as this one, ASM PBR Metallic Roughness. For the file, we're going to choose our FBX file, which we've got there. Click Open. Document resolution affects how sharp and detailed your textures are. You can use any number here at all. I like to stick with 2048, but whichever number you choose, make a note of it because we will be revisiting that number in a step in just a couple of moments. Make sure that all these options are checked as they are or unchecked as needs be. The important one to make sure is auto unwrap. Just make sure that that is ticked and then we're good to go. So we hit OK. And this loading part can take a few minutes, so go get a cup of coffee, cup of tea, maybe even a 3-course meal, because this is going to take a bit of time. So after what seems like an absolute eternity, your model will now be loaded into Painter. And what we need to do is we need to help Painter define the 3D data for the model. So if you go over to Edit on the top, and select Bake Mesh Maps. And then do you remember how I said you had to make note of whichever number you chose for the texture resolution? It's because it has to match this output size here. So in our case, it was 2048, so we select that. Make sure all of these mesh maps at the side are selected, and then at the bottom, click on Bake Selected Textures. And that will let you go through and generate some 3D data. We hit OK, and now we're ready to start making our first base color. A quick tip before we move on, I'm just going to show you how to manipulate and move the camera around your Mini. So if you hold down the Alt key and click on the middle mouse button or middle wheel button, you can actually move your model around horizontally and vertically. If you hold the Alt key and do the left mouse button, you can rotate your Mini around like so. Now if you hold down the Shift key and the right mouse button, and then you can move left and right to shift the lighting source in the scene so you can get a better view of your Mini. So the way the painting process works is that we group a series of layers together into a layer group. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a template color that we can then duplicate into other colors and tweak as desired. So to do this, if we go over to the Layers tab, and at the top you'll see a little folder icon, and this is where we add our groups. So we're going to add a group. We're going to rename this one template, and then we're going to make another group, and we're going to call this one color. And then we're going to take this color layer, this color group, and we're going to click and drag it into the template folder. This bottom layer one, we can actually select that and delete it using the trash can icon in the corner because we don't need it anymore. But this color folder is where we're actually going to make our colors. So the first color layer that we have to add is a base color, like a base coat for our colors. So we go over to the paint bucket icon, which is the add fill layer. We're going to click it, and it's going to add a new layer in our color folder. We're going to double click and rename this to base color. And then if you look in the properties tab over the side, you can see there's a whole section here, the bottom half, which defines the material aspects of this layer. So most of these we don't need. So all we're going to do is we're going to untick the ones we don't need. So we don't need the NRM of a normal map, we don't need the metal, and we don't need the height. The color is obvious, it defines the color of the layer, but the roughness defines how shiny the layer is. And we can adjust this by moving this slider up or down. So at the moment, our model looks quite shiny, there's quite a lot of specular highlights there. Whereas if we move it far to the right, you'll see that the model starts to get a lot less shiny and much more matte in appearance, which is what we want. So we're going to just leave that at the far end. Now the color, if we click on the color option, anyone that's used Photoshop, GIMP, any kind of painting software, you'll be familiar with this. So you can move around and select any color you like. You can adjust the hue, you can adjust the saturation, and you can adjust the vibrancy of the color. Honestly, I always spend ages picking my colors here. You could spend hours on all these options, just fine tweaking everything, but because we're a little bit pressed for time, I don't want to bore you guys to death. I'm just going to pick a standard base color for skin tone and leave it at that. You can always come back later and tweak these to your heart's content, but we're a little bit pressed for time. So we'll use that one as a starting point. So that's our base color done. Then what we need to do is add another fill layer, and this one we're going to call highlight. And we're going to do the same options again. So in the properties tab, we're going to untick metal, normal and height. We're going to scoop the roughness all the way up, and we're going to select a slightly brighter version of our base color. And there's two ways you can do this. You can either just go pick a random color in the selection, or you can use the eyedropper tool. Now if you click on this with the left mouse button and hold the button down, you can hover over any color on the screen and it will select that color. So seeing as we want it to be based on the base color, what we do is we go over to the base color preview, I let go of the mouse, and that has now selected the base color in our color palette. But we want it to be a little bit brighter, so we'll bump the vibrancy up a little bit and bring the saturation down, and that seems like a good highlight color. Now the next layer is optional. I'm doing this because I want my model to match the TaleSpire aesthetic a little bit more closely, but you don't have to do that, it's completely optional. But what I like to do is add a third layer and call this one wear and tear. So this layer is going to be any kind of scrapes or scuffs or parts where the paint's been chipped or worn away from the model. And again, same deal again, we're going to untick all the options that we don't need. We're going to pick a slightly brighter version of that color, maybe a little bit less vibrancy. Now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is where we define which areas these color layers affect. Now the way this works is, if anyone's used Photoshop, you know about masks and using them to help define areas and block off areas from being affected. So we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing here. And what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck the wear and tear layer so we can actually see our highlight layer. We're going to click on it, and then at the top there's an option for adding masks. So we can click on that, and we want to add a black mask. So if we click on that, this is going to add a new mask layer to our color layer. And if you look at the actual layer, you can see we have this whole other box selected on the layer. Now you can switch between these two by going over to the color, clicking on it, or going back onto the mask and clicking on it. So what we need to do now is, if we get this mask part, right click, go all the way down to add generator. That'll bring up a whole new look for our properties tab. So we need to click on generator, and down here we have mask editor. So click on that, and if you look at the model, you can see that it's kind of started to define the highlighted areas of our STL file. It's basically masked off any non-raised surfaces, and it's only applying that layer color to the raised areas of the model. And we can go in and tweak this and define it a little bit more. So on the generator properties, there's a whole bunch of options here. You could spend hours going through every single one, tweaking it, testing it, seeing what works best for you. But we're going to focus on this middle one here that says curvature. So if we click on that, So this is where we can help define the actual highlights of the model. So if we use our mouse wheel to scroll in and hold down Alt and middle mouse to move around and left button to kind of pan around. Now I'm going to adjust all these settings, and while I do, pay attention to the bones that are sticking here and the edges of the chest armor. If I go through and lower all of these like so, you should start to see all the detail disappear. So essentially what you do is you move all these sliders until you get a nice highlighted area for this particular color layer. And again, you could spend hours tweaking this. We don't really have that kind of time today, so what we'll do is we'll get it to a fairly decent looking spot, maybe increase the contrast a bit, and then if we just kind of change the opacity, so that looks pretty good. Now if we zoom out for a moment and take a look at our character's face, if we just zoom in and scroll, you can see that we've got some harsh lines on the geometry here. Now I'm not too sure what causes this, but a way I've found to kind of hide those lines is in the generator properties we have a global blur option. So if we just tweak this up ever so slightly, you'll see that those harsh lines just start to fade away a little bit. You don't want this too blurry, but you want it just enough so you don't really pay any attention to the details. But also, by the end of our complete painting process, you will not notice these subtle differences in the colour. Again, you could literally spend hours just going through every single one of these settings, seeing what works. But we're going to move on to the next layer now, which is our wear and tear layer. So we're going to click on the layer, re-enable it so we can see it, and we're going to do a similar process to the last layer. We're going to add a black mask, and then to that black mask we're going to right click, add generator, and we're going to choose the option next to the mask editor, which is the metal edges wear. And if I click on this, you'll see we've got a whole bunch of scuffs and scrapes on the model now. And again, just like the mask editor on the previous layer, you can go through and tweak almost every aspect of this particular generator. We want it so that it's some wear around the edges, but not tons. We don't want it to look like it's like 100 years old or something like that. So we're just going to tweak this a little bit. Now this one's interesting, the grunge amount. If we adjust this slider, you can see we get a lot more scratches, a lot more kind of secondary details that come up. We just want to tone that down a little bit. Now the interesting slider here is the grunge scale. Now when you say scale, normally you would think that it would make an image bigger or smaller. But what this actually does is if you slide this around, it changes the position of the grunge, giving you different options. So you can actually just kind of slide this around to get one that works pretty well. I mean, basically you could spend hours just tweaking all of these settings, but once you've got something that you're happy with, we can then move on to the next step, which is actually defining the colors for our model. Okay, so we have our 3 layers, we have our group, we can collapse that one for now. And what we need to do now is take a moment to look at the model and think, how do we want to break this up into colors? So on our Skyden model here, for example, if we just zoom out a little bit, I want to have different color groups. So we're going to have a skin color group, which is going to be the head, ears and torso and the fingers. We're going to have a leather group, which is going to affect part of the torso armor and all this armor on the legs and feet. We're going to have a green group, which is the color of the armor and the pants. We're also going to have a group for the gloves and a group for the hair items like the eyebrows and the actual hair. So what we have to do is if we take our template, close that down for a moment, and then hold down Control and press D, we can duplicate it. We can rename this to the relevant group. So this first one we'll call Skin. Then we hold down Control, press D, makes another copy, and we're going to call this one Leather. And then again Control D, and we'll call this one Green, and then Control D, we'll call this one Gloves, Control D, and we'll call this one Hair. We also have all these metal items that are on the model. So we'll do another group and duplicate that one and call that one metal. Okay, so what we can do now is we can go back through all these groups and actually define the colors a little bit more clearly. So for example, if we went to the leather folder, actually we'll just hide all these other layers for a moment, but if we go into the leather folder, we can actually change the base color to be a little bit more leather-like. So in our case, we can just darken it down a little bit, maybe give it a bit more red, something like that. And then we do the same for the highlight. We go in and make that a little bit more suitable for the leather color. And again, you can spend hours tweaking these. You can go backwards and forwards between groups and making sure that all the colors look right. I'm just going to leave that there for now. But basically, you repeat the same process for all the other layer groups. Okay, so I went ahead and tweaked all the colors for all these different groups. I also split the green section into two different parts. So I wanted to have a slightly different color for the top as I did for the pants. So I went and did an additional group for that one. I've also done a little bit of rearrangement. But what I've done is I've gone through each group and tweaked the base color, the highlights and the wear colors. I also tweaked some of the values on the generators. So for example, the mask editor and the metal edges editor, I kind of tweaked those a little bit. And now we've got all these really cool looking layers. But the thing is, each layer is now covering the entire model, which isn't that great. We actually just want to have specific areas that are those particular colors. So the way we do that is by adding masks to these groups. So we'll start off with the skin group. If we just hide all of these layers for a moment, just to focus on the skin, in fact we'll hide the template one as well. So with the skin folder selected, or the skin group selected, we can right click, go all the way to the top where it says add black mask, or alternatively you can use the icon at the top of the layers palette. But then if we click on the layer mask, we can actually start to define which area this color is going to be effective on. So we do that by going over to the toolbar at the far side and select the fourth tool down, which is the polygon fill tool. So we click on that. You can see our mesh now has a wonderful red wireframe running around it. Now if you go over to the properties tab again on the other side, you want to make sure that this option here is selected. This is the mesh fill option, and this is going to allow us to basically use a paint bucket to define which parts of the model we want this particular color applying to. So what we'll do is we shall zoom in using the mouse wheel onto the skin areas of our model, and then making sure that the mask section is selected and highlighted blue, we're going to just go over and click on a skin section, and it just defines that whole area for us in one click. Now if we scroll up and look at the head, we can repeat the same process. So just hover over a skin area, click, and then we can do the same with the ears and the same with the other ear. And then if we go over to the tools and select a different tool, so we'll just use the paintbrush tool, it gets rid of the wireframe for us. Now if we zoom out, we can see that here on the gloves we have a little bit of the mesh, the body mesh, poking through the gloves mesh. So the way we fix that is with the mask layer still selected, we can zoom in, kind of pan the camera around a little bit, and then if we go over to the tools and select the eraser tool, we can then click and drag to erase that particular part from the mask. So we can go over to the other hand, zoom in, do the same thing, zoom out. It's probably a good idea whenever you actually do a mask is just give your model a once over to make sure that there's no kind of any surfaces that are poking through that shouldn't be poking through. Now I actually know for a fact that on the back of this model, so if we turn her around, we can see that in the hair we have some skin poking through. So we'll do the same thing again, get the eraser tool, maybe scale the brush size down a little bit, and then we can just erase that area from that particular mask. And then you just go around the whole model, making sure there's nothing poking through. And once that's done, you can then move on to the next layer. So we'll do the same thing again with our leather group. So if we re-enable that, so we're going to right click, add black mask, go over to the polygon fill, make sure that the mesh fill option is selected, and then we're just going to click on any area that should be leather. And you go around the whole model and just repeat this as you go. And after a few moments, there we have the leather armor completely and totally defined. And then it's just a case of repeating the same steps for all these other groups. So once you've gone through and masked off all the different sections of the model, you should now have something looking pretty damn good. I mean, if we zoom around, we can see that there's no clipping, everything is being affected and painted evenly and nicely. But you might notice she's lacking a little bit of detail in the eye region. So what we have to do is actually paint in the eyeballs. And to do that, we're going to make a new group. And we're going to move that folder back up there, because that's a wonderful part of Substance, is putting folders into random folders. We're going to rename this one to Eyes. Okay, now what we need to do is, first of all, we need to actually apply a mask to this folder, same way we did all the other areas. So if we right click, add black mask, and go over to the polygon fill tool, make sure the mesh fill tool is selected. Now this one can be a little bit tricky to see, so to make it even easy to make sure that we're actually masking the right area, what I recommend you do is in the top right hand side of the screen, there's this drop down menu which says Material. If you click on that and choose Mask, this will take away all the color information from the model so you can see clearly which areas you are masking off. So with our tool selected and with our mask selected, we go over to the eyes, we click, and then we can see without any doubt our eyeballs are masked. Then what we can do is we can change the drop down back over to Material, and that takes us back into our regular view mode. Now to paint the eyes, what we're going to do is we're going to use paint layers and the paintbrush tool. So first of all, we need to add a couple of layers. So we get the paintbrush tool here and click, and that gives us a layer which we are going to rename to Rim. And then we're going to do another layer, and we're going to rename this one Color. We're going to do another layer. We're going to call this one Iris, and one more, we're going to call this one Glint. So if we select our rim layer and then go over and make sure that we have the paintbrush tool selected, we can go into the properties, and same as we did with all the base color layers, we can turn off all the options that we don't need. So in this case, we only need the color information. So we're going to click on that, choose a darker shade of the eye color. So Skyden, for example, has blue eyes. So for the rim, we want to go a little bit darker. So we'll get a nice kind of purplish color there. And then if we zoom in on the eye, now that paintbrush is quite big. So we go over to the size at the top and scale that down. Oh, that's a little bit too small. Maybe scale it up a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Right, so we kind of line up roughly where the center of the eye is, and then if you click and hold the left mouse button and then just make little circles with your hand, that can actually define the area of the eyeball. Hold down Alt and middle mouse button over to the next eye, do the same again, little circles just to define the area, and then we can zoom out a bit just to make sure that they're relatively lined up. Then we go up to the next layer, which is the color layer, and do the same thing again. We change the color to something a little bit lighter, like that. Maybe bring the saturation and the vibrancy up, then zoom back in. Again, that's a little bit big, so we'll scale the size of the brush down. It's a little bit small. So then we go to the middle, click, hold, then little circles, and the idea is to leave a little bit of the rim color showing around the edges to help define the main color. Then we go over to the other side, repeat the same process. That looks good. Then we go up to the next layer, which is the iris, which is solid black. And then we just want to have a smaller brush there. Yeah, that works. And then same again, just a little bit, not as much. Same on the other side. And then we go to the glint layer, and this one's just going to be a slightly off-white, so not super bright. But this one has to be a tiny brush, like that. And then we just put a little glint in the corner on each eye. And then if we zoom out, we can see we've got some pretty decent looking eyeballs. So our model is looking pretty good, our painting is almost complete. There's just a couple more details I want to add on. Now you could just stop here if you wanted to and skip ahead the next couple of steps, but because I'm using this in TaleSpire, I want to try and match that aesthetic a little bit more. And what I like to do is define the kind of the recessed areas of the model a little bit more, almost like putting a wash on a physical mini. So you'd get like a watered down version of like a dark color, paint it over the mini, and then it would actually just dry into all the recessed areas, which would then help define the color and the different sections, and it looks awesome. So to do that in here, what we do is we're going to make another group, and once again we need to move that to the top of the stack, close that group down, and we're going to rename this one Ambient Occlusion. You can call this anything you want. You could call it, wash, lines, anything you want. You could, you don't have to call it this. But what we do need to do now is put another fill layer in. So we click add fill layer, and then we're going to add a generator straight to this layer. So we're not going to do a black mask. What we are going to do is right click, go down to add generator, and then for the generator we're going to use this option here, which is ambient occlusion. So click on that, and we get some very interesting textures over on our mini. So what we need to do is in the generator options, turn off normal, metal, roughness and height, leaving just the color one selected. And then what I like to do, because if we look at this, it's a black and white image, all the recessed areas are darker, but I like them just to have a little bit more uniformity in the variance in width on the details. So to do that, I'm going to take this global blur slider in the parameters over here and just tweak that up just a little bit, just to give just a little bit extra detail. And then if we go back to our ambient occlusion folder in our folder stack and change the transfer mode from normal down to overlay, it basically gets rid of all the white areas and leaves just the dark areas, so all the recessed areas, really makes the details pop. But as you may have noticed, she's looking a little bit shiny. So what we have to do is go back to the fill layer, click on that, and just untick all the options in the material part here, so normal, metal, height and color. And then we take the roughness slider all the way up, and there we have our nicely detailed model. Now the last detail I like to add, just so that you can blend into TaleSpire a little bit more, is I like to add a bit of texture to the model, because at the moment, I mean, it looks great. It looks absolutely fantastic, but the models in TaleSpire have this kind of painted depth to them. There's like lumps and bumps on the actual surface of the model, so we're going to try and simulate that a little bit, not necessarily using the exact same textures that they would use, but we can get a decent approximation. So what we need to do is do a new group, drag that to the top of the stack, and we're going to rename this one Texture. And then over the left hand side of the screen you'll see the Asset tab, which we haven't really touched on yet, but we're going to right now. And in this tab you will see there's an option called Concrete Dusty. Now if you don't see it in the view here, you can actually search for it up at the top. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this texture preset and just drag it over into the folder. And then our Skyden goes into full concrete mode. So again, what we do, similar to how we've done on the ambient occlusion layer, is we need to just untick the options we don't want showing. So in this case, we don't really want the color showing, or a metallic feel to it, or the roughness. The only one we're interested in is the height. And what this does is if we zoom in, you can see that it's added little bits of bumpiness and detail to our model. And we can actually adjust this using the properties. So we've got scale, we can scale this up and down and have it more fine detail or more broad detail. We can also change how it rotates and basically change the position of all this detail. And basically you can spend a very long time, as I've done many times, just going through these settings and tweaking them until you get something that looks awesome. One thing you can do is, if you're not too keen on how defined the areas are, so for example on Skyden's face, we've got quite a lot of detail there on Skyden's face. I don't want it to be quite so defined. So what we can do is, if we go over to the Layers tab, and at the top where it says Base Color, we can change this to Height. And then we can go to the Concrete Dusty layer and change the opacity of it. And now as I scroll this down, pay attention to the model. As we lower it, it softens and makes the actual texture clearer. It takes, changes the opacity of it. So you can tweak this as well to get it in just the right spot that you think looks fantastic. So once you've got that to a point where you like, you just change the option from height back to base color, and we're back where we left off. And then that is pretty much our finished painting. We've got a really nice looking model, we've got some details in there, and it doesn't take that much work once you get the hang of how to organize all your layers. Now, if you've made it through all these steps so far and you're thinking that they might be a little bit time consuming or a little bit too complicated, we actually do offer some preset files over on our Patreon page. We actually have a tier which actually gives you access to all of the different paint presets that we have for all our different characters. It's updated regularly with new characters and new presets, but to use them, it's very straightforward. What you would do is you would download them, install them, and then all you'd have to do is go to the Assets tab, and in our case we want to look for the presets for Skyden. So we type in Skyden, and then we have this whole series of ready-made paints and textures. So all you would have to do is select one, drag it over to the model, or drag it over to the Layers tab, let go, and it applies the template that we have spent some time making today, but it does it in one go. Then you just mask off the area, like so. And you can do that with all these different sections. We can do the same again with Skyden's leather preset. So again, we drag that over, put it on top, apply a mask, get the fill tool, click on the mask, and then just go over all the leather parts. So that saves a whole bunch of time, and the best part is you can still go in and tweak all these colours to your heart's content. So if you want to go check those out, they're available on our Patreon. Now that we've got our finished mini, the next step is to actually export this out to use in Unity. So what we have to do is we go to File, Export Mesh, and leave all these options as they are, hit Export. We're going to pop this into the same folder that we had earlier, but I am going to do a new folder. I'm going to call this Substance Exports, just so we know where it is when we need it. We're also going to rename the output file to Skyden dot, don't forget the dot, obj, and hit save. And then once that's done, now it's actually time to export the textures from Substance Painter. So we go back over to File and hit Export Textures. And this brings up a new dialog window. Now what we need to do is we need to set up a new export preset for our minis. So the way to do that is if we go here to Output Templates, and then we want to add a new one. So we click on the plus icon here, and this gives us a new preset at the bottom of the list. So we're going to rename this by clicking on it, and we're going to call this Tutorial Export. Now, as you can see, I've already done this a couple of times, so I kind of got this down now. But making sure that one's selected, we need to create our export templates. So the first texture that we're going to set up is our base color, which is the one that contains all the shades and all the different colors of our model. So what we do is we click on the RGB plus A output, and that sets up this new layer. Now to name this, what we can do is there's this $sign here. So if we click on that, we can actually set it to automatically name this file after the mesh that we're painting. So in our case, it would actually name it as Skyden. So we click on that, get rid of this RGB alpha, and then if we put an underscore and call this base color and opacity, when we export this out, and any future mini we export out will have the mini name, and then, oh, hang on, I cannot spell to save my life. There we go, base color. It'll have the mesh name, so you won't actually get confused over which texture is for which mini. Now what we need to do is get the, where is it, base color option here from the maps, and we drag that over to the RGBA and set that to RGB channels. So the RGB channels of this particular file is going to be the base color. Then we need to add the opacity, so we go down to opacity, drag that over to the alpha channel, put that in the gray channel. First one down, awesome. Next up we have the metal and roughness map. So to do that one, we do another RGBA layer, and we're going to delete that this time, call it after the mesh, but we're going to add metal underscore roughness. Okay, and then what we need to do is if we go down the list to metallic and pop that over there into the grey channel, and then we need to get the roughness, which is actually over here in this converted maps list, but it's called glossiness. So if we click and drag that over to the alpha channel, put that in the grey channel, and that's another texture ready to go. Next up we have the normal map, which is just a simple RGB. Again, get rid of that, make sure it's going to be named after the mesh underscore normal. And for this one, we want to go again to the converted maps and select the normal OpenGL option, drag that over, put that into the RGB channels, and that's another one done. Two more left, and they're both going to be grey channels, so we can put the two grey channels in. The first one, we're again going to have it named after the mesh underscore, and this is going to be the height map. And for this one, we go to get the height, drag that over into the grey channel, and the last one is also mesh underscore, and this one's going to be the ambient occlusion, which I do not want to type out, so I'm just going to call it AO, and that one's right at the top of the list. Drag that over onto the grey channel, and that is our preset ready to go. So if we go back into the settings tab at the top, we can choose where our textures are going to go. So in our case, we put them in the desktop, paint tutorial, substance exports. We're just going to select that folder. The output template is the template we just made, so we're going to go all the way to the bottom to tutorial export. Then all the other options I'm just going to leave as they are, as default, and then we just hit export. And that's it, that's textures done, that's model done, that's everything done for Substance. Okay, so now we're back in Blender just for a moment, because what we need to do now is scale down the exported mesh that we just sent out from Substance so that it can fit in TaleSpire and actually be the correct height to match in with all the other minis. So to do that, we're going to go to File and Import, and we're going to choose wavefront.obj. And then we're going to select the Skyden model that we just exported from Substance Painter. Import, give it a moment, and then we're greeted with a absolutely gigantic, ginormous Skyden, which is just way too big for TaleSpire, so we need to scale her down. So if we make sure that we have the mini selected, and if we go over to the scale options, which looks like this little orange square, and we have these three scale options. Now this can take a little bit of trial and error if you're doing this for the first time. I had to adjust the height of the model, take it into TaleSpire, see how it lined up with all the others, go back, scale it down some more, back in TaleSpire, back and forth a few times. And what I actually found was that this particular mini, you should set the scale over here to 0.0085 in all three options. So 0.0085, go on to the next one, 0.0085. And then if we zoom in with the mouse scroll wheel, we can see we have a nice tiny appropriately scaled Skyden. Okay, so then what we do is we need to export this back out again as an OBJ file. So we go to File, Export, go down to wavefront.obj, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to overwrite the file that we exported out from Substance, just to keep things simple and less cluttered. So again, keep all the options as they are, hit export.obj, and then we're ready to move on to the final step and the final program, which is Unity. So we've just opened up Unity and now we get to add a new project. So we're going to do New, and we're going to call this one Paint Tutorial. And we're going to save the location as wherever you like. I've got a projects folder already set up, so I'm just going to leave it in there. We're going to hit Create, and here we are in Unity. Now, this part of the process is actually based off a tutorial by Lord Ashes on YouTube. Now, his tutorial dealt with converting animated 3D models into TaleSpire, but I've adapted it a little bit and just taken some notes from his overall tutorial. I'm going to leave a link down in the description in case you want to check that out. So, first thing we have to do is we have to set up our folder structure properly in the project. Now, what I've already gone ahead and done is set up the folder structure down in this project view down in the bottom corner. So you can see we have our assets folder, and inside there we have the board assets and editor. Now we'll come back to this one in a moment, but for now, if we go back to the board assets folder, inside that folder we have a character folder. And inside the character folder, we have another folder, and in this case, I've called it Skyden because that's the name of the character. And then if we go inside that folder, there's a content folder, and inside there, there's 4 more folders: materials, meshes, resources, and textures. So if we go back over to the project view and click the drop down on the content folder, you can see the same folders all there. And this folder structure matches TaleSpire, so it's very important that your folder structure matches in the same way. So just take a moment, look through this list of folders and just make sure that your folders look exactly the same as this, with the exclusion of the character's name, which obviously be your character's name. Now we're going to be working in the content folder for the next few minutes. Now what we need to do is import our scaled down mesh and our textures. So first of all, we go to the meshes folder, and if we bring up the file explorer and then go to where we actually left our export, so Substance exports, we have our object file and all of the textures that we exported out. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Skyden.obj file and drag it over to the meshes folder in the Unity project. Okay, so now that our mesh is in the project, we're going to do the same thing with the textures. We're going to select all of the textures that we've got, and then we're going to drag them over to the textures folder in the Unity project. And again, that's going to import them into the project. And then if we click fully back onto Unity, and then if we go to our mesh, so here's our Skyden in the project, we can click on, and then over on the right hand side of the screen, we have a few options that we can work with. There's 4 different tabs. There's Model, Rig, Animation, and Materials. If we just head to the Model tab for a moment, and then we're going to head down to about halfway down, there's an option that says Read, Write Enabled. We just need to make sure that that tick box is checked. Then, at the bottom of the options, there's an Apply button. So you click Apply. We are then going to go back up to the Materials tab at the top of the inspector. So click on Materials, and then if we go down to the 4th option down, which says Extract Materials. So we click on that, and then in the window that pops up, we can see at the top that it's showing the entire folder structure from this project. So what we want to do is we want to put this extracted materials into the materials folder in our content folder. So if you go to the top of the File Explorer window, click on Content, and then you'll see Materials, Meshes, Resources, and Textures. So if we click on the Materials folder and click Select Folder, that's going to extract the base material that's already set on the Skyden model into our Materials folder over here in the project view. Again, this can take a few seconds, but once it's done, if we go back to our project view over here, click on Materials, we can now see the file that we just extracted from our mesh. If we click on that file, this is where we assign the textures to our project. So we make sure that the default material is selected, and we can tell it's selected because all the options appear on the right hand side. Then, keeping it selected, we're going to go over to the textures folder, click, and then what we do is we're going to go down this checkbox list and assign the correct material, the correct texture, to the materials. So first off, we're going to start with albedo. I have no idea why it's called albedo, but that is actually our base color. So we click it, drag it over to the top of the inspector and drop it in the little box next to albedo. Then we're going to do the same for the next one, which is metallic. Now metallic is usually the one with the least amount of color information on there. So we're going to drag that over and drop it in the box. Then we have normal map, which is usually this bluey purpley one. So we click and drag that. A box will pop up saying that this texture is not marked as a normal map. So we can go along. On the side it says fix now. So click on that. Next up we have the height map, which is this grey one here. So we do the same thing again. Click, drag, drop in the box. Then we have occlusion, which is the black and white one. So click on that. Drag over and done. The next step is if we go to the meshes folder, like that, take our Skyden model, click and drag into the scene, we can see if we scroll in with the mouse wheel and then move horizontally and vertically by holding the middle mouse button, we can see our model now has all the textures applied and is ready for the next step. So what we need to do is if we go over to the folder view in our project and click on the content folder, that brings us back to seeing the materials, meshes and textures in our main view here. And what we need to do is up in the top left is the sample scene that has the main camera, Skyden and the directional light. We want to take our Skyden model from this list, click on it and drag it all the way down next to the textures folder down the bottom. And then if we let go of the mouse, it comes up saying, which option would you like? So we're going to choose original prefab. And now what we have to do is actually assign all of these folders to an asset bundle. And the way you do that is you click on the particular item you want to assign, and at the bottom of the screen, on the right hand side, there's an option down the bottom that says asset bundle. And we can actually click on this, create a new asset bundle, which we're going to call simply Skyden. Notice how I'm keeping the same name for all the naming processes during this whole walkthrough. It's very important. So we're going to rename this one Skyden. Now, a bit of a bug that happens sometimes in Unity is that you start typing on here and it doesn't show up. So what you have to do is if you resize this panel, so we've resized, click on the asset, go to add a new asset bundle that we're going to call Skyden, and it works. Weird bug, interesting workaround, takes seconds. Click enter, then we're going to go to textures folder, and we're going to change the asset bundle down the bottom to our Skyden set. Same thing with the other folders as well. Click, go down, assign to Skyden, meshes, click Skyden, materials, click Skyden. Okay, so now that we've actually assigned each of these items to an asset group, now we actually need to build the asset bundle file. Now this next part of the tutorial is again based on someone else's tutorial on how to set up an automated asset bundle compiler. I'm going to skim over it a little bit lightly here. If you want to see it in a bit more depth, there's a link down in the description. But the quick version is that what we need to do is in our editor folder over at the side, we need to right click and create a new C script. We rename this to make asset bundle, and then if you right click and choose show in Explorer, that'll actually open the file up in Explorer, and then we can open this in a text editor. So here's the file. Now I've already done this part, so what I'm going to do just for time, I'm going to open up the one I've already made in a text editor, and then I'm going to select all of this text here. Again, you can find this text in the link down in the description, and all you do is you copy it, go to your newly made script file, delete everything that's in there, and paste in the text from the file you've just copied online, and then save. Then we can close that down and close that window down. So what this file tells Unity to do is to take all the assets that are in the content folder and shrink them down, compress them down into one single file. So to do that, we go to the content folder, go over to our list of assets, and then just right click in that window, and at the bottom you'll see a new option, build asset bundles. So we can click on that, and it will actually run through the script, take all the information, all the assets and all the textures, mix them all up, compress them all down together into one brand new file. And then once that's done, we can go over to our assets folder, right click, show in Explorer, and then we go to assets, and inside there you'll find a new folder called streaming assets, and this is where the script put our finished file. So we go in there, and here it is, just simply named Skyden. Obviously with yours it'll be named whatever your character's name is, but in our case it's Skyden. So it's this file that we now need to take over to TaleSpire. And when you set up the R2 Modman software and you have installed Lord Ash's custom mini plugin, you will have a TaleSpire custom data folder, and inside that folder you'll have a minis folder. So what we need to do now, go into the minis folder, we're going to make a new folder here that we're going to call Skyden. Again, same as the file. Then inside that Skyden folder, we're going to drag the Skyden file, and then we're done. Now we can go over to TaleSpire. Again, just as a reminder, this will not work on a non-modded version of TaleSpire. You have to be running Lord Ash's custom mini plugin. Okay, so here we are in the yawning portal, and what we're going to do is we're going to bring up our library, and we're going to go and find just any old model. I do, however, recommend that the one I use is in the elf category, and it's this elf commoner here. Now the whole reason for choosing this guy is that his whole body faces directly forwards, which means that any custom mini that we overwrite this guy with, as long as they're facing forwards, will face forwards. You won't have any kind of issues with them being off axis or kind of moving around strangely. You move them forward, they'll go forward. So I always recommend this guy. So then if we click on him, hold down the control key and press M, that brings up the custom mini plugin. And this is where we can type in our file name. So we type in SKYDEN, type in Skyden, click OK, and boom, done. There is our wonderfully painted custom mini straight into TaleSpire. If we zoom in, we can see all the detail that we added, we can see all the textures, we can see all the different colors, and it's all looking absolutely amazing. But that's it, guys. That's pretty much all there is to it. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, be sure to leave a like down below. If you have any questions or comments, by all means leave them and I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. But yeah, hope you enjoyed and happy painting.